this new book, published by Oxford University Press a couple of months ago. When they asked me to write this book, I was very pleased to do so for two reasons. One, because secularism, like the rule of law, like human rights, like even liberal democracy itself, is a concept that is fundamental to modern life, but like those other concepts, is increasingly threatened and under attack, not only in our part of the world, but all over the world, globally. And that's an important reason, I think, to be talking about it. But even more than democracy and human rights and the rule of law, secularism is in difficulties, because unlike those other concepts, it isn't even really defended by anyone very well. So it's threatened by all the same people that threaten those other liberal aspects of the liberal political order, nationalists, religious extremists, extreme conservatives, and some people will talk about later. It's threatened by all those people, but it's not even defended to the same extent that things like democracy and human rights are. There's not as much pushback on secularism's behalf. And that's partly, I think, because not many people know really what it is. It doesn't feature on any school politics curriculum or exam syllabus. It hardly features on university politics curricula, at least in Europe, apart from as sometimes a sub-theme within the general concept of liberalism. So it's, although fundamental to the way we live now and what's made us modern, it is under attack and weakly defended. And the second reason why I was pleased to write this book is because it's part of, it doesn't look like it yet, but it's part of the OUP's very short introduction series. So, you know, there's little paperbacks, very short introduction to whatever, and they've got 500 different topics that they're a very short introduction to. They'll come out in paperback in about a year and a half. Don't let that prevent you from investing wisely in the hardback, which is much more attractive in every way than the paperback will be, visually at least. But books in that series have to be very objective and very disinterested, and try and be informative rather than argumentative. And I quite like the challenge of writing, I'm an argumentative person, and also a strongly believing secularist in political terms. And I quite like the challenge of writing in an informative rather than argumentative way. Some people think I've gone too far. There was one humanist political philosopher who said that the bit about the arguments against secularism was far too convincing, and that it ought to be got rid of. But the idea of writing a sort of balanced introduction to the topic, something that's there to inform rather than to necessarily persuade, was very appealing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about secularism in the same themes that are... The word secularism was first coined in the mid-19th century in English by a man called George Jacob Holyoake, who meant it to describe anything that was non-religious, really, any approach to morals, any approach to ethics, any approach to society or politics that was non-religious. He was inspired by a previous generation of Enlightenment thinkers, and he in turn inspired a whole new generation of social activists. He was inventing the word secularism. He was really the founder, in the UK at least, of the secular and later of the humanist movement, and also of the cooperative movement. So he was very busy, and had a lot of very good ideas. Now, he meant secularism to apply to all these different non-religious concepts. Today, the words atheist or humanist more usually describe this type of approach that Holyoake meant to capture, thank you very much, in relation to social thought or morals or whatever. And the word secularism, in UK English at least, has become more narrowly used to apply to politics. An approach to the ordering of nations, communities, states. That's what secularism is mainly used to mean today. Now, even this more narrow political secularism has many different definitions, and in the book I chose to use a definition that was popularised really by the French sociologist and scholar of secularism Charles Babreau, who said that secularism has three aspects. First is the separation of religious institutions from the institutions of the state. So the two sets of institutions are separate, and there's no domination of one by the other or interference, really, in one by the other. And this is the earliest type of secularism, really, that you might see, for example, in modern Europe, where there's an attempt to separate these two. A second aspect of secularism, as far as Babreau is concerned, is the state should be concerned with maximising freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion and belief for everyone as far as possible. Of course, we all know you can't have completely unqualified and unlimited freedom, because at the very least your freedom has to stop where it starts interfering with someone else's freedom, if you're living in society. But to the greatest possible extent compatible with the rights and freedoms of others, the state, the secular state, wants to ensure freedom of thought, conscience and religion for all. And the third aspect of secularism, as I've discussed in this book and as Barbara would have it, is that the state doesn't discriminate against anyone on grounds of their religion or non-religious worldview. It takes care to treat people equally, regardless of their religion or belief. And this is really the last aspect of secularism to develop chronologically. It's really in the second half of the 20th century that states started taking care specifically not to discriminate against people on these grounds. So there were states where institutions were separated, there were states that signed up to human rights instruments that said that they should maximise freedom of thought and belief, but only very recently and most cumulatively in the European Union, specifically in the directives, equality directives of the European Union that states have applied, has equality on these grounds become an issue. But these three aspects are constitutive of secularism as far as Barbara is concerned, and many scholars of secularism, and as far as this book is concerned. So, in the book, what do? Well, I look at secularism in some real... I start by looking at secularism in some real-life states. And what I do at the very beginning is look at some secular states, some examples of secular states in the West. And then, because one of the great fallacies about secularism is that it is somehow solely a Western phenomenon, or even mainly a Western phenomenon, or originally a Western phenomenon. And that's not entirely true. So in the next chapter, I look at secularism outside of the West. Then I look at some of the academic definitions of secularism, which I'm not going to discuss this evening. Then arguments for secularism, and then arguments against secularism, and then discuss some of the current debates and controversies around secularism. I haven't got time for it. The book takes 2 hours and 43 minutes to read, on average. You may be interested to know. Obviously, I don't even have 2 hours and 43 minutes this evening, so obviously I can't cover everything that's in the book. I'm going to talk a little bit therefore about secular states in the West, secular states outside the West, and the arguments for and against secularism, and leave the rest of it to the very reasonable part of the volume itself. So, secularism in the West. I said there was a prejudice amongst many people that secularism is wholly or mainly a Western phenomenon. An equally common prejudice is that it's entirely a modern phenomenon. And this, of course, is not completely true. Now, explicit secularism, constitutional secularism, that's about the separation of religion and state, is, of course, a modern phenomenon. But if you think about some of the pre-Christian political arrangements in Europe, think particularly... This is a bust of Epicurus, by the way, completely irrelevant apart from I wanted something to illustrate Greek civilization, and his bust is rather magnificent, so I chose Epicurus. And also Epicurus is quite a good guy, so gaze upon his Greek visage, but know that he represents all of Greek society rather than just Epicurean philosophy, as you might have been thinking. If you think back to the first book written in Europe systematically to analyse politics, which is Aristotle's Politics, when Aristotle talks about the aims of the state, he doesn't talk about the aims of the state in any way that implicates them with the aims of religion. Greek city-states, of course, have temples and gods. Their temples may be maintained at public expense, and their festivals and rituals may be at times of public holiday. But Greek gods don't try, and Greek religion doesn't really try to interfere in the business of the city. Aristotle's description of the aims of politics are cast entirely in human terms. He says that the aim of the city, of politics, polis, is to achieve the same end as the aim of a human life is to achieve. So a just situation, fulfillment in this world, is entirely a matter of the here and now politics. And this is a sort of secularism, or at least it's there as laying the seed for explicit secularism in later culture. Well, what succeeds, of course, the multiple paganisms of the Roman Greek world is the rather oppressive religion of Christianity. Christianity, as you know, begins around stories of a Jewish preacher in the early part of the last 2,000 years, and it slowly grows until it's in a position really of complete state power within the late Roman Empire, and then it sets about systematically destroying all of its opposition and destroying all the books and destroying all the culture and all of the religions and beliefs that preceded it. So it can seem unusual, given that its beginnings as a political religion were so oppressive and so absolutist, to suggest that Christianity itself might have a role to play in the development of secularism, but of course it does. And it's ironic that we had to wait for a pushing together of religion and the state to the extent that Christianity did it, to the extreme extent that Christianity did it, for us then to arrive at secularism, but nonetheless that's how it happened. Because Christianity, right from the beginning, being essentially concerned with otherworldly matters, at least at the basis of its theology, contains within its thought always a possible distinction between this world and the next. And you don't have to go very further than just thinking about rendering to God what is God's and to Caesar what is Caesar's, or thinking about the lines that Jesus has in the New Testament about, you know, God's kingdom not being of this world, to realise how some Christians, were they minded to do so, could use their theology in order to develop an idea of separation between state and church. And indeed, after a few centuries, quite a few centuries, that is what some Christians did. And the earliest people in Europe to expound a theoretical separation of church from state were Christians, were the Baptists in England and in the Netherlands. And so Christianity has an important role to play in the origins of secularism in the West. But really when secularism as an idea takes off is in the Enlightenment, that period from the late 17th century to the very beginning of the 19th century, mostly therefore in the 18th century, where the philosophers, in French the philosophes, are challenging authority wherever they see it, intellectual authority, political authority, and of course religious authority. And one of the ideas, the philosophy of the Enlightenment don't really agree on much. You know, they prize disagreement and the bubbling intellectual conflict and contention that comes with free thought. But one thing that they do agree about, and that marks a fundamental change in how thoughtful Europeans see governance and politics, one of the things they do agree about is that the justification for power, the legitimacy of government, doesn't derive from above, from God, flowing down through monarchs or even oligarchs, but the legitimacy of government derives instead from below, from the people. And that government is legitimate if it has the consent of the governed. And applied to every area of life, of course, this has profound consequences, but applied to the idea of what should be the right relationship between religion and state, church and state, it leads, of course, to theoretical secularism. But secularism at the time of the philosophers is still theoretical. It hasn't, by let's say 3/4 through the 18th century, been achieved anywhere. The two states that I study in the West, as examples of secularism, are France and the United States. France, although it was the homeland of a large number of Enlightenment philosophers, and the language almost of the Enlightenment was French, at the end of the 18th century, its politics were still those of a totalitarian monarchy. And you know that there's a French Revolution, 1788/1789, that topples that monarchy. Now the French Revolution isn't a single event, it's a decade-long series of constitutional changes and upheavals that leads eventually to a sort of settled state, although of course France goes on to have revolutions throughout the 19th century before it ends up to where it is today. But it begins with the toppling of the monarch, and together with the monarch falls also the Catholic Church. Now the Catholic Church in pre-revolutionary France is hand in glove with the absolutist monarchy. The church is the largest landowner in France, it's exempt from taxes, the clergy enjoy a status as the first estate below only the monarch, the same status that the clergy continue to enjoy in England today. If you watch something like the Remembrance Ceremony, for example, when the royal family leave the cenotaph, the next in line to leave are the bishops and the priests. Before then the aristocrats come and the lords and the commons. That's largely symbolic today, they're not solely symbolic, but in pre-revolutionary France it was not symbolic at all. The clergy really were the first estate. The Catholic Church was the most powerful social institution after the political institution, after the monarchy itself. And when the revolution comes, therefore, the Catholic Church is the target of the revolutionaries. There's a declaration, the first Declaration of Human Rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. That's at the beginning of the revolution, and that declares for the first time in law in Europe that every person has the right to freedom of thought, freedom of opinion, even in matters of religion. And as the revolution progresses, the Catholic Church is disestablished from the French state. Divorce is introduced, marriage laws are secularised, education is secularised, and at some stages in the French Revolution this tips over into a genuine persecution of Christians, forgetting about the freedom of religion that was declared in the revolution. Priests are lynched, Catholics have property confiscated and are attacked and mobbed. Many leave France, and the French Revolution, you say, even arrests the Pope. He dies in prison, actually, so they probably contributed to his death. But alongside these excesses, which of course are not secular, in the way that we've just discussed, lies also a desire by some revolutionaries for a secular state in the more genuine way that we described at the beginning. Now Napoleon, when he comes to power as first consul and then as emperor of the French, ends the bloody heyday of the persecution of Christians, of de-Christianisation, as some historians call it. He forms a concordat, a treaty with the Pope to put an end to the persecution of Catholics in France. Catholicism is recognised as the religion of the majority of the French, but there's no question of a return to its social power, the social power that it enjoyed, political power, or the social power that it enjoyed under the monarchy. A new Department of State is introduced to regulate the Catholic Church, and indeed to regulate all religions, because it's not just the Catholic Church that's recognised now, it's also the Lutheran Church and Judaism. Wherever the Napoleonic army conquers, in Europe or elsewhere, ghettos are closed down, Jews are emancipated for the first time in a long time in Europe. Napoleon is a great hero for this reason alone. And the Napoleonic Wars is just one of the wars on which the British century. Well, Napoleon wants his religious settlement, this freedom of religion type settlement with some state regulation, to be the one that endures, but of course all emperors have their desires unstitched by time, and it doesn't endure. Throughout the 19th century there's a back and forth between two principal political forces in France, a very secular, republican, leftist movement, and a generally more Catholic, monarchical one. Back and forth, divorce is made illegal, then it's made legal again. You know, hospitals are secularised, then they're desecularised, then they're secularised again. Until, at the end of the 19th century, in the Third Republic from 1870 onwards, there is a period of secularisation which endures to this day. And in 1905, there is the law passed, which is the law on separation of church and state. The Napoleonic ministry is dissolved, property is returned to churches, apart from to the Roman Catholic Church that instead requested that the state keep hold of it, which is why the state of France still funds every pre-1905 Catholic Church within the Republic of France, which is one of the things that limits its claim to being secular in practice. But anyway, the 1905 law declares the state to be secular, and in the present Constitution of France, obviously introduced in the mid-20th century, the text of the 1905 law and of the Declaration, actually, of the rights of man and citizen, rights of man and the citizen, is formally included in that Constitution. So French secularism now is firmly in place. It's contentious, continues to be contentious in the 20th century, with some French, especially around Catholic education. That remains a source of controversy. But by the end of the 20th century, it's mainly seen as an uncontroversial, almost essential aspect of French citizenship. Until, of course, the present time, when, particularly in connection with French Muslims, there have been renewed controversies and debates about the nature of secularism, its extent, and whether it is even a political settlement that can endure in an increasingly diverse society. So if we think back about refer back to the triple definition that Barbaro gives, the state of France certainly is secular in that religious institutions are separated from political ones. if you discount the maintenance of every pre-1995 church, which is quite a significant mixing up of the state and religion. But it's pretty much separate. There is, to a great extent, freedom of thought, conscience and belief. The French state does, to a significant extent, intervene to safeguard that. For example, if you think about the burkini bans a couple of years ago, when some right-wing French mayors in the south of France decided they wanted to ban wetsuits, essentially, for Muslim women, the French Constitutional Court, applying the secular law, overturned those bans. So it said, you know, France is a secular state. To be a secular state means that people have freedom of thought, conscience and religion, unless they're interfering with the rights and freedoms of others or posing a threat to public order. These women are not posing a threat to public order or interfering with any of the rights. Therefore, France as a secular republic should allow them to wear what they like. So it does maintain people's rights. But on the third aspect of secularism, the equal treatment, there has been, I think, cause to question whether or not this is the case in France completely in recent years. And the way that some laws, for example, like the banning of religious symbols in public schools, might be taken to fall disproportionately on, as it were, non-Christian religious people, i.e. religions that have visible religious symbols they want to display, I think call into question the notion of equal treatment. But nonetheless, France is a good example of a secular state for all that. America is also a state in the 18th century that becomes secular in the 18th century, but its secularism is rather different in flavour, if not totally in type. Now, in America, in France, laïcité is the word used to talk about secularism. Americans are far more likely, although America is probably the most secular state in the world, actually, if not ever in the world. Society is completely non-secular, but the state is probably the most secular in the world. But Americans don't often talk about secularism as reflecting their constitution. They're much more likely to talk about religious freedom or religious liberty. And it's in this phrase that secularism is encoded, really, in American political culture. And the American colonists, the descendants of mostly of European colonists on the west coast of America towards the end of the 18th century, when they declare their independence from the British state, or the British Crown more specifically, they're not doing so in the same sort of context that the French revolutionaries are declaring their freedom. Particularly, there is no one central, controlling, oppressive religious establishment in the fledgling United States of America against which they're fighting. So there's no analogy for the French Catholic Church in revolutionary America. So they're very much more so than the French anyway, starting from scratch. And what they want to protect, unlike the French version of secularism, what Americans want to protect is not the individual from religion, but religion from the state. And so when they try to decide what their constitution should reflect, firstly, they introduce in the constitution, right from the start, a ban on any religious tests for public office. So in the UK, in Great Britain, at the time, you had to be an Anglican in England to go to university, become something carried on to the 19th century actually. Go to university, get a degree, become a member of Parliament, whatever. So they introduce, the American Constitution introduces straight away a ban on any religious test of that sort, because they want people to be free to practice their religion without sanction. And then a few years later, when the American Constitution is amended, because it's deemed to be insufficiently protective of the rights that the Founding Fathers want to have protected, the First Amendment, with which you're familiar, which is made to the Constitution, protects freedom of speech, and then provides that the American state shall make no, I've forgotten the exact phrase, shall make no provision regarding an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So the American character of secularism that's introduced at that stage is about not establishing a church ever, in the United States, and never impeding the free exercise of religion of anyone within the United States. That's not how it works out in practice, of course, but that's the aspiration. This idea of religious freedom and liberty, very much associated with Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, who is one of the founding fathers who cares most, probably, about religious freedom, being a very peculiar person himself, at least in his religious or non-religious beliefs. He really cares very much about religious freedom and liberty. He's the man who coins the phrase, the wall of separation between church and state. He wrote the Virginia law on freedom of religion, and then of course helped to draft the Declaration of Independence. His thought is very transformative. So America establishes itself as a secular state, as a non-Christian state. One of the first treaties that the United States government signs with a foreign government has specific phrase within it to say that the American nation is in no way founded on the Christian religion. But that doesn't mean that the revolution is universally popular. And America, rather like France, experiences this back and forth throughout the 19th, and indeed is still experiencing it now, but certainly throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, where Christians, particularly Christians of a strong Protestant bent, want to desecularize the Constitution. It's not the case that all founding fathers were, radical atheists, but they certainly were not of the same religious persuasion as most Americans. They weren't as religious as most Americans were then, and certainly in the course of the 19th century went on to be. A lot of American society was shocked when a non-Christian like Jefferson was elected president, and the Christian fight back against the secular constitution began very early. It focused by the mid-19th century on the attempt to have God inserted into the American Constitution, called the God in the Constitution controversy. They wanted Jesus in the Constitution, really, but they accepted that might be a little bit too much for people to accept, so God would do, because everyone, after all, would know which God they were really talking about. Didn't succeed in that, but did succeed in the late 19th century in getting In God We Trust written onto the paper money and then the coinage of the United States, and did succeed in the 1950s, when fear of godless communism was particularly acute, did succeed in the 1950s in having under God added to the Pledge of Allegiance. It used to be that American money had no religious anything on it. It used to be that the Pledge of Allegiance had nothing religious in it, but the Christian anti-secularists have succeeded in watering down the secular state to that extent. But by and large, and principally through the offices of the courts, America, like England, is a nation with the rule of law established in a court system, and the Supreme Court, therefore, has been, rather than the political realm, as in France, it's the Supreme Court in America that really moulded the development of secularism, and principally moulded the definition of what free exercise would be. So it's quite, you can say that everyone should have free exercise of religion, but pretty immediately you find that is impractical, to say the least, in a society where people have to live with other people who have different views from them. And the Supreme Court's played a particular role in setting the boundaries of where free exercise can end and ought to end. Things like Mormon marriages, ruling those criminal, when the Constitution might seem to allow them because of free exercise. Drug consumption, illegal drug consumption in the pursuit of spiritual ends. Various cases that have come to the Supreme Court in the last couple of hundred years. Well, the present controversies in the United States tend to focus around the involvement of religious groups in politics, and particularly the continuing attempt by some aspects of American society to see the United States as a Christian country rather than as a secular state. And those, I think those efforts are ultimately doomed, because the Constitution is very resilient in the United States, and I think it will contain them until they disappear socially. But nonetheless, they are a present controversy. Well, is America as secular state as France compared with our initial definition? Certainly, there is a separation of religious institutions from state institutions. Some religion has crept into some state institutions, but usually at a relatively petty level. there is freedom of thought, conscience and religion in the United States, and I think you can make a plausible case for the United States being the country in which there is more freedom of religion and belief than there has ever been in any other state in the history of humanity. Is there equal treatment? Well, there's equal treatment by the state, yes, to a very large extent. It is not the fault of the state that no non-Christian could ever plausibly be elected president. And that's the fault of the American people. The state itself has not made this so. Well, we can debate that perhaps. But one thing about America that certainly is different from France is the character of its secularism, as I said. In France, this idea that it's mainly separation that it should be about, keeping religion out, because it's dangerous and citizens ought to be protected from it. And in America, largely keeping the state out of religion because it's interfering, people should be free. Secularism in the East really has as ancient a character, or as ancient an origin, as secularism in the West. I won't dwell on this in general so much because I want to get on to my two specific examples, which are Turkey and India. So certainly there are ancient indigenous examples of political arrangements between religions and princes certainly, but governments more generally, that are secular, largely across Asia. Secularism in the East is also, this chap embodies colonialism, as you can see, it's pretty unmistakable. There are also secularist influences in the colonial era, which seems strange when you one tends to assume that the colonial era is all about missionaries, but in fact colonial states sometimes are deliberately secular because they don't really want to get involved in religious controversy, they just want to get as much money as possible out of the people. And then of course there are independence movements in the 20th century, which are often, this is Nehru and Gandhi, we might talk a bit more about in a moment, which are often secular. I mean, sometimes are inspired by religion, but are often secular. And just to be clear, in this bit, I'm talking about states that eventually become secular, not the many states outside of the West that don't end up secular, but in the states that do become secular, these three things tend to be true in terms of the past formation of that secular character. Then there are independence movements in those states that often have had to inspire populations that are religiously diverse and therefore take a generally non-sectarian approach to their independence organising, which leads to a more secular approach in general. So the two examples I use are Turkey and India. It's a very short book, so I would use a lot more if I could. Turkey, as you know, once the centre of a large empire, in its time the largest empire in the world. The Ottoman Empire stretches at its height across North Africa and into Europe, but starting around the 12th century. But by the 19th century, by the late 19th century, is flagging. It's being outperformed economically, industrially, militarily by European states. It's facing nationalist insurgencies, especially in its European territories, often inspired by a Christian ethnic identity. It does make an attempt around the 1870s to try and forestall this sort of problem by introducing some limited reforms which move it closer towards a secular state along the French lines, especially in the apparatus of the state, but really it doesn't go very far. And then in its final mistake, the Ottoman Empire supports the wrong and the losing side in the First World War and is dismembered. And then there is a revolution, and a man called Mustafa Kemal, who later received the honorific Ataturk, and it's by the name Ataturk that he is known, becomes president of this republic until his death. It's not a democratic republic. Becomes president of this republic until his death, and he is a great secularist, and he secularizes the Turkish state. So the previous rule of the Ottoman Empire had been the Sultan, and in his role as the Sultan, he ruled over the domain, this earthly domain of the Ottoman Empire, and in taking the title of Caliph, he was asserting not only his temporal power, but his political succession to Muhammad himself, so that the idea that he wielded also spiritual authority over all the world's Muslims, not just the Muslims that happen to fall within his territory. Ataturk abolishes the caliphate against the wishes of large numbers of European governments and even independence campaigners elsewhere. Gandhi was a great fan of the caliphate, strangely. The British state was quite a big fan of the caliphate because it was very useful for it to be able to get pronouncements from the caliphate as to what Muslims should do, as long as those pronouncements were in line with what the British wanted them to do, for example, in India or elsewhere. But Ataturk abolishes the caliphate. The Republic, for a few years, has an Islamic character in the constitution, and then it's declared to be secular. He secularises the civil service, he secularises the schools. He doesn't just secularize the schools, he brings in Dewey, the American humanist, to rewrite the whole curriculum. And he goes further than just secularizing the state and attempts to really eradicate various religious social institutions as well, closing down mystical orders and reorganizing the religious institutions of Turkey along quite similar lines to those that Napoleon took. So there's a Ministry of Religious Affairs is created, which still exists, to govern the affairs of the majority denomination of Islam in Turkey. And this, unlike American or French secularism, which although they had their opponents, had popular support as well at the beginning, this secularism is undemocratic. It is a non-democratic sort of secularism. And the tragedy of Turkey in the decades since the revolution is that every time people get a chance to vote, their votes move Turkey further and further away from secularism and towards a sort of Islamization of their politics, leading to the aphorism that, you know, Turks can have democracy or human rights, but they can't have both. Because every time democratic elections have proceeded towards their eventual end in Turkey, it's been a move away from secularism towards Islamization. Then the military have a coup. The military are very secularized, or were a very secularized elite in Turkey. The military have a coup, restore secularism, although every time they do restore it over the 20th century, it's slightly weaker than it was before. It's diluted by way of certain compromises. And then, after the military coup has finished its work restoring secularism and republican democracy is reintroduced, and people move slowly further away from secularism and towards a more Islamized form of government, and then there's a coup and so on and so forth. So that's probably come to an end now, because as we know the last coup was not successful, even if it was a coup at all. But the point is that secularism in Turkey was not democratic. And this popular opposition started right at the beginning, was organised by imams in the early days of Ataturk, although he crushed that opposition. Now, however, as I say, it is slowly retreating. That's the story of Turkish secularism. I think a good question, though, to ask about Turkish secularism is, was it ever really there in the first place? Because although Ataturk succeeded in secularizing state institutions, schools, universities, general civil service departments, and so on, Turkish state maintained and still maintains a very controlling influence on religious institutions. So although there's a separation of state institutions from religion, there's not a separation of religious institutions from the state. And the Ministry of Religious Affairs still trains all the imams, licenses the imams, writes the sermons that are delivered in the state licensed mosques on Fridays, and maintains almost theocratic control of religious institutions. So I think it's dubious whether it was ever really there. If you wanted to find a parallel for Turkish secularism, you might probably find it in the sort of extreme secularism of the ultra-French revolutionaries, or possibly of Napoleon mixed in with them. And the last type of secularism that I study in real life is the secularism of India, which is extremely interesting in all sorts of ways. India fits well into the general template of secularism, secular states outside the West, that I said a moment ago, in that it has a lot of ancient examples of secularism. One of the earliest manuals for princes, I think 3,000 years ago, has advice for Rajas on how to maintain the appropriate distance between their rule and the various Brahmin who will try and interfere with it. And it's got quite a secularist bent to it. India, of course, is characterised even from its earliest times by diversity. It's a massive continental region. Of course, there are Hindus, but even the word Hindu as a catch-all term conceals enormous diversity. And in addition to Hindus, of course, as Indian history proceeds, we get Jains and Zoroastrians, Sikhs much later on. With the Muslim invasions of India, we get Muslims, we get Christians, and so on and so forth. And there's great diversity, therefore, of a great spiritual diversity. I hesitate even to call it religion because it's not quite organised even in that way. Great spiritual diversity. And also great diversity of governments in the various states that arise across India. The colonial state in India, of course, is Britain. And British colonialism in India, this is a caricature, it's not completely true, of course, but British colonialism in India is not religiously very interested. Of course, British involvement in India starts as completely commercial. The British government is not initially involved in what becomes the colonial state. And that really remains the overriding British priority in India. And they've no interest in making India Christian or getting involved in any religious controversies in India whatsoever, because that would be a distraction from the main aim of the colonial state, which is to suck as much value and GDP out of India as possible, whilst keeping people just about alive, in which the British state is extremely successful in this, of course. In fact, the British government didn't even want to allow Christian missionaries to go to India, but the UK Parliament defeated them on a vote and forced them to allow Christian missionaries into India. So the British state in India adopts a governance model of convenience, where it just divides people into groups and then gives them separate laws, separate family laws in particular, to be adjudicated according to their own rights and customs. So there is a Muslim family code, a Hindu family code, and a Zoroastrian one, and others, and they're administered in their separate ways. And this is a type of secularism, although of a very strange type, as we'll come on to. And then, as I said, at the time of independence, one of the things that everyone is united on in the independence movement is that the future India should be a secular state. Well, in fact, Jinnah, who is the founder of Pakistan, also declared that the state of Pakistan would always be a secular state as well. So it's not just India, of which that was true at the time, but the independence movement was secularist in character. But it was a secularism of diversity. So Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, spoke, of course, how the state maintained a sort of respectful distance, an equidistance from all these different religions. And if the secularism of France was about protecting people from religion, if the secularism of America was about protecting religion from the state, then the secularism of India is very much about sort of protecting everyone from everyone else and trying to hold a line, mediate a diversity that exists. And this, of course, has led to great controversies. One of the most obvious ones in context is this problem of one law for all. So in the Indian constitution, there's a stated ambition that the secular state will proceed to introduce a uniform civil code across the whole of India. And this has never happened, and instead, in many areas of law, the old arrangements along the British model of separate laws, family laws, are still maintained. And there's a big controversy at the moment, and has been for 20 or 30 years, as to whether or not Muslim family law in particular, related to marriage and family life, should be brought into line through one new civil code. Some people argue that it should be because it's one secular law for all. Various Muslims argue that it shouldn't be, because if their Muslim law is changed to be the same as this civil code, they say that's not a secular law, that's a Hindu law, just with the name secular on it, because it's an imposition on them of someone else's religious practices. And why can't they keep their law? Why can't secularism allow for that diversity and equal treatment of them? And that there are many other present controversies, not least political, with the rise of Hindu nationalism in India. I'm going to skip over that. Arguments for secularism I'm going to treat very briefly, because they're pretty familiar, and you probably know them all. But the arguments for secularism hinge around the basic concepts of liberal political philosophy, in fact. So, there's the argument for freedom. This is the idea, and if you think about someone like John Stuart Mill, you won't be far wrong, that the human being, we all want to make our own minds up on important questions and on the choices that face us, and it's an important part of human life that we should have that freedom, and if the state constricts us, limits our choices, deprives us this opportunity to be able to grow in whatever direction that we see fit for our fulfilment, then we're harmed. And so the secular state, which doesn't do those things, is the best because it doesn't harm people in that way. That's in brief, right? And that's just the liberal humanist version. There are religious versions of that argument too, of course. Fairness, this is a basic argument about justice. If you're a Jew in a country that limits high political office to atheists, or if you're a Christian in a country that only allows Islam to be taught in state schools, obviously you are being treated differently from another person. If you believe in justice, and of course the argument for justice always is predicated on the idea that most people do want to be treated fairly and therefore accept their obligation to treat others fairly, then in the domain of religion, a secular state is the fairest option. The argument for peace, sometimes called the pragmatic argument, is really just about saying, look at the history of the world, look what happens when the state picks a side in religious controversies, acquires a religious character itself, look at the blood-drenched fields, not just of Europe, but of Asia for the last 300 or 400 years, and see that the only way to prevent this war of everyone against everyone else is to have a state that lifts itself above religious controversies. That, as Thomas Jefferson said when he was asked what the state should do about religious controversies, he answered, ignore them. The state just lifts itself above all of that and doesn't pick a side. Those three arguments are pretty, religious and non-religious people could agree about them. The argument for modernity is less likely to be made by religious people. It's the argument that people like Ataturk or Nehru, who hated religion, or the ultra-French revolutionaries made. The idea that, basically if you want to succeed in the modern world, you've got to clear away the rubble of superstitious religious thinking. And the argument from democracy, which is very popular in relation to a country like India, this is an argument really for equal citizenship. It says, how can we all feel like equal members of a single political community if some of us are of the religion of the state, if some of us are official and some of us are not? How can we actually partake of that equality which is necessary for democratic citizenship? This isn't an argument that's very appealing in the UK, where we don't have democratic equality. But in some countries, especially in republics, it's a very popular argument, like in India or in France. And together these arguments make a cumulative case. You'll usually hear secularists both today and across time and the world making them all, and they're sort of cumulative. Well, if the arguments for secularism all fit together, the arguments against secularism are quite diverse. Obviously the oldest argument against secularism is the theocratic one, this idea that nations exist under God. I believe in one God. I have read his holy words. They provide not just a perfect template for my own personal life, but a template for all humanity, and therefore, of course, the government should implement them. The most recent example of this, of course, is the state of Iran, but there are large numbers of Islamic states that believe where the government is based on this assumption to a greater or lesser extent. There are no real Christian theocracies left in the world apart from the Vatican, which, of course, the Pope rules as an absolute monarch, but there used to be Christian wannabe theocracies. Usually those countries that were once Christian theocracies, if they're not now democratic secular republics, are established churches. And the argument for established churches against secularism is quite interesting. It's increasingly interesting, actually, if you think about something like the Church of England in this country or the Danish church in Denmark. Now, England is the most extreme example of an established church in the world. We're the only state in the world to require daily Christian worship in state schools, the only state in the world to require that. We're the only we're the only democratic state to have church representatives in Parliament because they're members of the established church, 26 bishops in the House of Lords, and so on and so forth. We're one of only 4 countries in the OECD to allow state-funded religious schools to select on religious grounds. So a really egregious, extreme example of an established church. But the argument in favour that the established churches make in favour of themselves, now that they no longer simply make the argument, the Anglican God is the one true God and everyone just should be members, is that established church states provide a better way of achieving freedom and equality than separation. And the way that they help with that is that if you're a Muslim, let's say, and it normally is a Muslim that they're arguing about, if you're a Muslim in England, as opposed to France, in England you're aware that the state is religion friendly because it's an established church, and even though it might not be your religion that's established, it's a religion, and isn't that better and more hospitable than having the state having no religion? And that's usually the case made for established churches. And it's, on the face of it, it can be plausible. I mean, plainly, England is a better place to be a dissenting Muslim than Turkey, even though Turkey is a nominally secular state, and England is, if not a theocracy, an established church. Nations under Marx, I deal with these very briefly in the book. If the book had been written 30 years ago, if we'd been standing here 30 or 40 years ago, we'd probably have seen the Soviet Union as an example of a secular state, or Cuba or Albania. In fact, through large parts of their history, they were not secular states at all. They privileged and established a very particular type of atheism, especially Marxist-Leninist states, a materialistic form of atheism. Although Albania and Cuba in the 70s were the only states to officially declare that atheism was the doctrine of the state, at different times, both Cuba and Albania, even though they said they were nominally secular, and the Soviet Union, which was nominally secular throughout its life, restricted high office to people who had particular beliefs, promoted a certain sort of atheism in the school curriculum, and so on and so forth. So they're really just the flip side of the coin of nations under God. There aren't many states like this left, probably toward more freedom, and only North Korea is a state that dares to be honest. Well, he doesn't even dare to be completely honest about it, taking this approach. It's largely dead as an approach. The last 3 arguments against secularism, I'll be very brief. The last 3 arguments against secularism are not ones that necessarily have to come from religious people. Romantic conservatism, the best example in England of this in history was Edmund Burke, and we see a good example today in India in Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. Now the argument for secularism is premised on the idea that you accept that the state, well, that society, the nation, is something that's made up of rational, or often rational, rational actors who together, consent to a sort of social contract, and that we have institutions that allow us to make and remake, our laws on that basis, and that's how society, briefly and stereotypically, but there you go, that's how society is organised. But not everyone sees society as made up of rational individuals in that way, and the state is the product of a social contract. Some people see it quite differently. Someone like Edmund Burke in the 18th century saw the nation not as that type of thing, but as something more organic, as a tradition being passed on and developing a situation where those of us who are alive today are really no more important than those who die before us and those who will come after us, and that our real role is to tend to this organic thing that is the nation, associated with place and with tradition, with culture and with ethnicity. And although that needn't take you in a religious direction, often it does. Burke thought that therefore it was the right thing for someone living in England to be an Anglican. He wasn't a theocrat, he didn't think everyone should be an Anglican. His wife was a Catholic. But he thought that people who were in England should be Anglicans, people who were in India should be Hindus, people who were in Turkey should be Muslims, and so on and so forth. And this is similar culture to Hindu nationalism, which is formed the government of India now, as you know. It's a funny sort of argument, hard to get into unless you really already, believe it. Then there's an argument made by Western liberals, which is sort of the trixiest of arguments, really. This argument that has become to be called the myth of neutrality argument. This is the idea that secularism, they say, claims to be neutral, claims to offer an objective framework for government, but in fact it's not neutral. It's the product of a Christian and then a humanist Enlightenment culture. Inside of it, inside of secularism, there are biases inherent as a result of that background, that cultural background that it has. On the big level, things like even the idea that public and private can be two separate spheres, or that religion is something that can be separated from public life, is a product of late Christian or Enlightenment humanist thinking. And on a small level, things like the idea that marriages between one man and one woman is a Protestant thing. Why can't Mormons have more than one wife or whatever? That just shows how secularism is really full of values and choices, and really just a sort of Protestant/humanist imposition on the world. I mean, you can see the arguments against that, of course, but it is hard to make that case because there's something superficially plausible about that argument. I mean, when the Mormons who brought their cases to the Supreme Court in the United States in the 19th century said, "Why have I been convicted of the crime of bigamy? The Constitution protects my free exercise of religion, and both I and my wives believe that this is right and is the free exercise of our religion," the Supreme Court had nothing much to say apart from, well, it isn't. They find it very hard to justify. Still a challenge today. If we have time at the end, I'll say what the answer is. But I mean, it's not immediately evident. And then this last argument against secularism will come now, I think, to be probably most easily identified by the labour of multiculturalism, the multiculturalist argument against secularism, which is to say, secularism treats people as individuals. In fact, we're not just individuals. We all exist in social relationships with each other and other people. We exist, therefore, as members of groups. One of the most important types of group that exists is religious groups, and therefore the state ought to recognise the religious groups that exist in society, not just the individuals who have rights to freedom of thought and conscience, but the groups. Now, taken to extremes, this is provided the constitution of the Netherlands for some time, and of Belgium, where you had this thing called pillarisation, where society was divided literally into Catholics, Lutherans, and liberal humanist freethinkers, and so on. And then each of those groups had their own trade unions, their own political parties. Today, still, the Dutch government divides its international development funding between humanists, Catholics, and Lutherans, and they all spend the state money how they see fit. Indonesia, which obviously has Dutch cultural heritage as well from its colonial past, has a similar pillarised arrangement. But if it's rare to see this multiculturalist approach applied to the whole state, it still is detectable at a lower level in some parts of the state. So, for example, it obviously informs the approach to state schools in England, where we've seen increasingly separate schools established for different religious groups, and the argument being that religion is something important to group identity and to socially, and therefore the state ought to organise its public services along religious lines. And in England, the state has said yes, we ought to. Maybe they didn't do that on principle. Maybe they did it because, unfortunately, they're shackled with a load of Christian schools they can't get rid of, so they've got to treat everyone fairly. But nonetheless, it's an example of the state taking a multiculturalist rather than a secular approach in that particular public service. So the case against secularism, unlike the case for secularism, is extremely diverse. But those arguments are all still made today, and in some parts of the world, as I say, they are not only in the ascendant, but winning the argument. I think I better stop there because this is only the third or fourth time that I've talked about the book, and I think that I might have to cut my cloth more sparingly because I think I've spoken for over an hour. Is that right?
We do have some time for Q&A.
And you want some time for comments and questions. And also you're selling the book, which is people haven't bought it, Here it is.
You should.
And it's got lovely orange paper. Isn't that nice? That was a great surprise when I saw it for the first time. I like it anyway. Questions, comments? Yes.
I've heard the phrase militant secularism bounced about a lot recently, and I'm wondering why you think secularism has acquired this kind of caricature in that it's aggressive or forceful, when in fact inherently, obviously it's not.
Not. So I think partly it's to do, so I think we have to take the words separately. So partly it's to do with the misnomer, well, let's start again. Partly it's to do with the confusion about what secularism is, and partly it's to do with the confusion about what aggression is. And the confusion about secularism, I think secularism does suffer as a word from having two main usages, although the usage I've been describing this evening that the book's about, and is the mainstream usage in the UK at least, is to describe particularly politics and the separation of church and state. In the United States, and in many other countries therefore that speak international English, secularism means, you know, non-religiousness, atheism, humanism, you know, so on and so forth. It means this political thing as well. But for example, this book's just come out in America 2 months after it came out in the UK, and the reviews in America are riddled with confusion on this point. Right? And if you are an English speaker in the Arab world, or in large parts of Latin America, or in many parts of the world, you're often speaking US English rather than UK English, and often your cultural reference points are US ones rather than UK ones. And I think that when aggressive secularism is talked about, or aggressive secularists, I think it's not very often that they're referring to the political settlement of secularism. They're often referring to, you know, people who say religion is really stupid, it's obviously wrong, no one should believe it, what's wrong with you? And in terms of aggression, I think this is just a sort of trick, really, to use the word aggression when really what's being talked about is, you know, rudeness at worst, and forceful argument, you know, most of the time. I think that religious groups, and especially religious groups with political ambitions, are very, very clever in tarnishing and choosing the right phrases to tarnish their opponents. And they, you know, especially something like the Catholic Church, which has survived by hook or by crook, you know, for so long, by doing, you know, precisely that. And so I think it's quite often, you know, just a deliberate escalation on the part of the people who are attacking secularists. I mean, no secular state has ever, you know, persecuted religious people, and the states that have been sort of like, you know, only nominally secular, like for example Turkey or the Soviet Union. So whereas religious states have persecuted everyone, like, you know, all the time. There's more to it than that, obviously, but that was a short answer. You probably might seem quite long. Yes, was that a question? Earlier, a moment ago? I saw you waving. No, at the beginning. Maybe you were yawning. Sorry. Oh, sorry, it wasn't you at all. I imagined it. Yes?
You seem to define Marxism as being really like a religion. You know?
Marxist-Leninism.
So therefore, if a state defines itself in terms of atheism, it's not a secular state.
Yes.
It's just another version of religious state.
Yeah.
Is that legitimate? I'm not sure about that.
Well, I mean, I think we have to... Here we go. Going back in time. I'm going to start all over again. I didn't get it right. Hold on. Okay. I mean, if you look at... so obviously, I'm talking about states that take a Marxist-Leninist approach. So obviously, Marx himself wouldn't have said, you know, let's have official atheism and, you know, persecute religious groups. But Lenin thought that it was, as we all know, fair enough to try and help history along a bit, and that, you know, religion could be legitimately a target, firstly because it was false, you know, taught people to believe things that weren't true, and was bad for them intellectually, and firstly it was bad for them politically because it taught them to be satisfied in this world. I mean, these were Lenin's two justifications for building into Marxist-Leninism active persecution of active suppression of religion, because religion was false and politically damaging. So, communist, you know, Marxist-Leninist states, they didn't... I mean, you have to decide whether or not religion is analogous to atheism in this construction. But I can't see any difference between a state promoting Christianity and a state promoting atheism when compared to a state that promotes no religion or belief. So I think that there's no separation of religious institutions from institutions of the state in the Soviet Union, because there is a department of state dedicated to promoting atheism. There's no freedom of thought, conscience and religion for all, because if you're religious, your freedom to act in pursuit of your conscience is limited. But if you're of the preferred atheist type, or if you're a non-Marxist atheist, your freedom of thought and conscience is restricted as well. And there's certainly ample state discrimination. You're discriminated against in that you're unable to hold public office unless you subscribe to the articles of the state, just like under a theocracy, where you have to subscribe to the 39 articles of Church or whatever. And in school, your children will be taught atheism and the specific Marxist-Leninist version of atheism, as opposed to any other view. So I think they're analogous.
What about a secularist state that promotes secularism? And it comes into contradiction with particular religious groups, and it says that our secular values should transcend your particular religious values. I mean, that is arising now, like, people saying that not providing wedding cakes for
right,
beggars,
yeah, that's
because
right.
they're saying, well, you're giving secular values transcendence over our particular religious values.
So now we've come back, I think, to this myth of neutrality argument, which is the anti-secularists who say, look, you're not neutral, you've got values, and you're promoting these values. Now, actually, there's nothing, I don't think there's anything intrinsically secular about promoting same-sex marriage, right? So I think it would be the critic that you've just given sort of hypothetical voice to, I think would be wrong to say that it's secular values that are, making them have to do a cake for same-sex marriage or whatever. I think that let's take it that American Mormon again. Okay, so the American Mormon in the 19th century, who says, free exercise, why can't I have it? I want to marry all these women and they want to marry me. And you're imposing these values on us. And he George Robinson, or whatever his name was, the man who actually brought this case, he said Protestant values. You're imposing Protestant values on me. Let's take the Baker example because it is the one that comes up most recently. The Baker says you're imposing secular values. What they mean is values that aren't mine. You're a secular state imposing values that I don't share on me. Well, I don't think that secularism actually has much to say about this or is to blame for it. It's not secularism that has led the state to decide that they want to prohibit discrimination against LGBT people in public service provision. It's it's a desire to prohibit LGBT discrimination, just as it's a desire to not execute people for murder or to lock up people for
But does that give it the
rape
right to transcend the religious thing?
So
that's the next step.
Okay, so let's agree and discard the idea that it's secularism that's done these things. Okay, then I think that takes us back, because this is often the case with the myth of neutrality. Is they say secularism isn't neutral because it's doing X, and you have to start by saying, well, hold on, it's not secularism that's doing X. In the case of bigamy today, for example, it's far more likely to be opposed on grounds of gender equality than it is, on grounds of Protestant ideas about marriage. And in that specific case, as in the cake case, it's the state's desire to eliminate discrimination against gay people. In the bigamy case, it's the state's desire to eliminate unequal treatment of women, or there's a suspicion that there's oppression of women going on there. So it's not secularism that's doing that, it's something else. So you say, the question then becomes, why is it legitimate for the state to limit my religious freedom in order to pursue the aim of LGBT equality? And there, the state relies on saying that, okay, we accept that you believe that same-sex marriage is wrong, you don't want to do anything that celebrates or promotes it in any way. Okay? You're also bringing a product to market and engaging, in regulated trade in society. And the state then has to try and mount an argument to say that it's legitimate limiting this baker's freedom of thought, conscience, or religion in order to protect the rights and freedoms of another person. And that's the debate that you have. So the secular state will say, I want to protect your freedom of thought, conscience, and religion and belief to the fullest extent possible, compatible with the rights and freedoms of others. And then you have to have an argument about it. And in the UK,
it's an argument that really, in the end, secularism doesn't give much guidance.
It sets the playing field, I think, and says, you know, it's up to you now whether the rights and freedoms of others.
So whether you believe rights have some transcendence over religious freedom or something like that.
Or which particular rights do. Exactly. So, for example, everyone's pretty comfortable with the idea that the right to life should trump your belief in sacrificing me to the gods, right? You know, and that the right not to be tortured should trump your belief that, you know, I've got to have my arm cut off, you know, with no anaesthetic in order to bring about the Messiah or whatever. I mean, I've made that up, but, you know, whatever. I'm sure there are people who believe that there, because there are people who believe anything, or everything rather. But there, you know, there's a line, and at the moment, debate is clustered around where the line falls, I think, between sexual orientation and people's freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. In the past, you might have found it clustered around other controversies, like, for example, military conscription. Very controversial example of this. Beating children. I mean, a case that was decided in the House of Lords in the 1990s, I think it was 98 or 99, was whether or not independent Christian schools could continue corporal punishment. I always get that mixed up. Yeah, exactly, crucify the children. No, about whether Christian independent schools could practice corporal punishment, and the justification was somewhere in Christian books. I don't know, whatever it says, hit your children, whatever. But that was their justification, and the court said no. You know, that's not where the line is. You know, the children have a right to physical integrity; they're not your property, and so that's where the line was drawn. But what those Christians were saying is, this is our religion.
So,
yeah.
So if what you said earlier about the fact that the state can be secular, but the population aren't necessarily secular.
Yes, and that's true of most secular states. Yeah.
And they obviously dictate what happens in terms of the laws that are being produced by the state. So going back to the Mormons, if it had been a Mormon majority
yes.
in the United States at the time, they could potentially have made the law such
yes.
that it was possible to have something which we would now think is discriminatory against the women.
Yes.
Well,
so if they'd been the majority, I suppose you might not have thought that now. You might have agreed with them.
So I'm trying to figure out in that sort of situation.
Yes, that's quite right. I mean, I think
secularism come in.
So I think that's why someone like Charles Barbaro. Well, I know that's why. That's why someone like Charles Barbaro and most contemporary scholars of and advocates of secularism won't just talk in terms of separation of religious institutions from state institutions. Because, like you say, there could have been no establishment in the United States, and yet a majority population of Mormons who decided that all women should be, you know, multiple wives of men. But would that have been in keeping with what secularists today, or with what secularism has come to mean more fully? No, it wouldn't, because what secularism has come to mean more fully is protection of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion for all, and no state discrimination against anyone on grounds of their religion or non-religious worldview. So it's a bit like the tension between democracy and human rights. You know, which is an ongoing dynamic, not dynamic, but an ongoing tension, and it's what makes liberal democracy rather than just democracy. If you liberal democracy depends on having a framework of protection even for minorities. Now, at this point, the Mormon case becomes less useful, because actually I probably believe that Mormons should be allowed to marry. Mormon men should be allowed to marry more than one woman, and Mormon women should be allowed to all marry one man. I probably think that's right.
What it made me think was, what laws are we allowing to be passed today, which actually potentially in the future we'll look back and think, well, maybe that wasn't such a good idea.
Well, in the UK, loads of laws, probably because, as I said, the UK is a terrible state. I mean, the UK is literally one of the outside of the Islamic world. The UK is one of the worst states in terms of freedom of thought, conscience of religion, and equal treatment. We're the only state to have, well, this is certainly true until recently. We're the only state when the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief visited the UK and made her report, the UK state said they were going to implement 0 of the recommendations that she made. You know, at least some other states implement 2 or 3. And the UK were going to implement 0. So I think we're not a terribly good example. I'm sure there are lots of laws, therefore, that are being passed today that are problematic. We don't even think about them. I mean, one of the benefits, to take a personal view rather than something from the book, one of the benefits of it being a secular state actually is with a secular legal framework, somewhere like France, is that it forces you to think about the implications of some of the measures that you might be taking. I mean, France has a burqa ban, which is, you know, to my mind, not something that I would want to see. In the UK, it's something that I think is probably wrong. You know, but at least because they're a secular state, they had to think about why they were doing it a lot more than we would have to think about it in this country. It had to be justified, it had to be argued in the courts, it had to be argued ultimately in Strasbourg.
Well, they were very clear with the freedom of expression argument. They stuck very much with the safety and the...
Safety and security, exactly. And the grounds that it was defended on eventually as well was also the necessity for free interchange amongst citizens of a republic, which of course is something we couldn't have here either. But yeah, exactly. So it forced them at least to clarify the reasons why they were doing it. I think that what they did was still wrong. But you know, being a secular state with a secular framework, secular principles, you know, constitutional principles, means that you have to think about these things. I mean, you know, in the United States, unlike one of the things that makes the US different from Saudi Arabia, is in the US, if government wants to do something, they have to either think about at the pre-legislative stage, or can be challenged at the post-legislative stage, of how that does or doesn't limit people's freedom. And that's part of the American Constitution. It's part of the constitution of states that have explicit secular protections. Now actually, the UK to that extent is almost a secular state in some ways, because we have the Human Rights Act and we have the Equality Act, and people can therefore challenge, you know, public authorities have to think about whether what they're doing might be challenged. But you know, so I'm not saying we're as bad as Saudi Arabia, by the way, just for the avoidance of doubt. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.